Today we are diving into a critique of a submission about the dead internet, specifically looking at how AI bots, model collapse, and dopamine-driven algorithmic feeds are supposedly destroying the web.
Yeah, let us just get right into the feedback to see how we can make this already sharp, alarmist analysis even stronger.
Right, so looking at the first section, the author opens with a pretty stark claim. They cite statistics showing that automated bots now make up, I think it is anywhere from 35.2 to 53% of all web traffic.
Right.
And the core argument here is that this automated traffic has officially outnumbered human activity. And because of that volume, these bots are just flooding the internet with low-effort AI-generated synthetic content, which the author calls Slop.
Yeah, that is really the foundation of their whole thesis. I mean, they are relying heavily on those raw traffic volume metrics to substantiate this idea that the internet as a human space is fundamentally dead.
But looking closely at this framing, I am questioning if treating all bot traffic as evidence of a dead internet actually skews the reality of how the web operates.
How do you mean?
Well, it feels a bit like looking at a massive, highly efficient car manufacturing plant and calling it a dead town simply because the workers on the assembly line happen to be robotic arms instead of people.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Right? We rely on those machines to keep this system running. I mean, a bot that checks if a hospital's website is online every 60 seconds isn't generating AI slop. It is performing basic infrastructure maintenance. So doesn't lumping everything together kind of weaken the author's premise?
It really does. Refining the distinction between benevolent infrastructural bots and parasitic agentic AI will elevate the alarmist tone from a general grievance to a precise systemic critique.
Okay, so walk me through the mechanics of that. How do we get there?
Well, the weakness in the current draft is exactly what you just pointed out. It lumps all automated traffic into the exact same dead internet bucket. The text treats benign systems like, Google indexers, simple uptime monitors, or even accessibility screen readers as if they're identical to the highly aggressive agentic AI bots that actively displace human users.
Right, and they pollute the digital ecosystem.
Exactly. And by failing to separate the necessary background infrastructure from the actual thread, the author dilutes their own point. It leaves them vulnerable to really easy counterarguments.
Yeah, I can see that. If a reader with any technical background sees that the author doesn't understand the difference between an uptime ping and a generative AI scraper, they might just dismiss the entire piece.
Precisely. So the suggestion to fix this is to sharpen the focus by explicitly contrasting traditional bot behavior with the new extraction gap of modern AI crawlers. Doing this shifts the focus away from sheer volume and highlights the inherently hostile, extractive nature of the modern synthetic web.
Extraction gap. That is a really interesting concept. So how do we get the author to translate that onto the page? Like, what are some concrete examples they could use to illustrate the shift in behavior?
To implement this, the author could highlight a specific metric from recent Cloudflare radar data. It shows that Anthropic reads roughly 4,580 pages for every one referral it sends back to a human creator.
Wait, really? Over 4,000 pages read for just one click sent back?
Yes, it is a massive ratio. And the author should explicitly contrast this extraction against traditional search engines. Google, for instance, crawls about 5 pages for every one referral it sends back.
Wow, okay, that is a huge difference.
Right, because a traditional search engine indexer crawls the web to build a directory. Its ultimate goal is to connect a human user with human content.
Yeah.
An AI crawler, on the other hand, ingests the web to bypass the human creator entirely. It absorbs the information to generate a synthetic answer, so the user never even has to leave the chat interface. So it is extractive, it is not connective.
That paints a very different picture. The behavior is structurally parasitical. It is taking the raw material of human thought and offering basically zero economic or social return to the ecosystem it is harvesting from.
Exactly. And alternatively, if the author wants to show how the internet is actively reacting to this, they could point to the fact that crawler block rates jumped from 10% to 36% in a single year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that metric demonstrates that website owners are treating these new AI bots as an invasive species. I mean, they are altering their robots.txt files to just slam the door on these specific scrapers.
Right.
So using these examples focuses the argument on the behavior and the economic damage of the bots, rather than just throwing a massive volume percentage at the reader and, hoping it sounds scary.
Yeah, that is much stronger. So if these extractive crawlers are locking humans out and relentlessly scraping the web for content, what actually happens when they run out of genuine human material to scrape? Because I think that leads directly into the author's next point regarding model collapse and digital decay.
Yes, the technological feedback loop.
Right. So the material details the mechanics of the Shumalov paper published in Nature. It outlines how future AI models, which are now being forced to train on the very AI slop they previously generated, begin to lose the tails of their data distribution.
They hallucinate, they degrade, and eventually erode digital truth altogether.
Exactly. And the author paints this as an inevitable mathematical death spiral. But I want to push back on the inevitability of this decay. The text treats model collapse like a terminal disease.
Right.
Is it truly an unavoidable doom loop, or is it just, a form of digital inbreeding that massive tech companies who have billions of dollars and the brightest engineers in the world can simply engineer their way out of?
That is the million-dollar question. Acknowledging the proven mathematical workaround to model collapse will actually make the underlying warning about human data scarcity far more compelling and urgent.
Okay, so explain the gap in the author's logic here. Where are they missing the mark?
Well, the weakness is that the text presents model collapse as an unavoidable terminal doom loop for artificial intelligence, completely ignoring the crucial scientific finding in that very same Nature paper.
Oh, they left something out.
Yes, the science shows that accumulating real data alongside synthetic data provably prevents this collapse. Because the current draft omits this, it reads a bit too fatalistic, and more importantly, it totally misses the nuance of why the tech industry is actually panicking right now.
But wait, if the collapse is technically avoidable, why does it remain a threat to the internet?
Well, the suggestion is to shift the angle of the argument from collapse is mathematically inevitable to collapse is avoidable only if we can preserve high-quality human data.
Ah, I see.
Yeah, adjusting this framing dramatically heightens the stakes of the impending information drought. It changes the narrative from just a passive observation of a dying system to an active, desperate race by these companies to secure the last drops of human authenticity.
That makes a lot of sense. So how does the author concretely show this mechanical difference to the reader without getting bogged down in, overly dense mathematics?
One way to achieve this is to explicitly contrast the replace training scenario with the accumulate scenario. The author can explain that if AI companies replace old data with synthetic slop, the model's error rate grows to infinity. It suffers from what we call functional approximation errors.
Okay, let us ground that term for a second. What does a functional approximation error actually look like in this context?
Think of it like taking a photocopy of a photocopy. The original image has really sharp lines and deep contrast.
Right.
Mostly fine, but it loses some texture. If you take a copy of the 10th copy, all the nuance is just gone, and you are left with this blurry, gray mess. In language models, the nuance is the tales of human expression, the rare idioms, the unique dialects, the strange but beautiful ways humans construct sentences.
Yeah.
So when AI trains on AI, it smooths out those tales, regressing everything to a highly probable, incredibly bland statistical mean.
It forgets what makes human language actually human.
Exactly. But if the engineers accumulate, meaning they mix their new synthetic data with a preserved, ever-growing foundation of clean human data, the error rate hits a ceiling, and the model survives.
Okay, so the photocopy retains its sharpness because they keep referencing the original document.
You got it. Explaining this proves to the reader that the author deeply understands the technical nuance, rather than just repeating a doom-scrolling headline.
And it sets up the actual crisis. Because if they need a constant supply of original documents, a fresh human data to keep the system alive, they have a massive supply chain problem.
That is the crucial pivot. So from there, the author could introduce the epoch AI projection as the true ticking clock of the piece. This is the research projection warning that high-quality human language data on the internet will be fully exhausted by 2026.
Oh wow, that's soon.
Yes. By showing that fresh human data is the absolute only cure for model collapse, the author makes the disappearance of real human content genuinely terrifying. It is not just that the internet is getting messy, it is that the critical fuel required to keep the intelligence engine running is actually running dry.
That framing takes a theoretical math problem and turns it into an urgent physical resource crisis. It explains the causality behind the facts.
Yeah, it raises the stakes of the entire piece, making human thought the most valuable and endangered resource on the web.
So, if the human data is running out, and the web is increasingly filled with this extractive synthetic slop, what is the actual cost to the people left consuming it? That brings us to the final section of the submission, the neurobiology of slop.
Right, the psychological impact of existing inside this synthetic architecture.
Yeah. The author discusses how algorithmic feeds microdose dopamine via the ventral tegmental area and use variable reward schedules. They argue this ultimately starves users of genuine human connection and oxytocin.
Which is a very fair point.
It is a critical point, but I have to note that comparing social media to a digital slot machine is, it is a very tired trope. We have been hearing that exact metaphor since 2015.
Yeah, at least.
So I am wondering if the material is missing the deeper physiological consequences. Doesn't this synthetic ecosystem do more than just momentarily distract us? Doesn't it structurally rewire the actual hardware of the brain?
Expanding the neurobiological analysis to include reward prediction error and structural receptor downregulation will transform a familiar complaint about screen time into a profound medical warning.
Okay, I like where this is going. Where is the specific gap in how the author currently explains the dopamine effect?
Well, the weakness is that the argument correctly identifies dopamine's role in anticipation, but it completely stops short of explaining the physical toll of these volatile neurochemical cycles.
Right.
Because it stops early, the authors claim that we're being starved of connection feels slightly unsupported on a clinical level. It sounds like a philosophical complaint about loneliness rather than a biological reality of structural decay.
It is the difference between saying, I feel isolated, versus my brain is now physically incapable of processing a slow, normal interaction.
Exactly. So the suggestion here is to deepen the relevance of the argument by integrating the specific mechanisms of neuroplastic remodeling. The author needs to prove that the brain is being physically altered to reject slow, genuine human interactions in favor of rapid synthetic slop. It is not just behavioral conditioning, it is cellular adaptation.
That is fascinating. Give me some concrete examples of how they can weave this biology into the text without sounding like a medical textbook while still maintaining that sharp, alarmist tone.
For example, the author could detail neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz's concept of negative reward prediction error.
Okay, how does that work?
So the author can explain that dopamine doesn't just spike when you get a reward. It is a learning signal based on prediction. When an algorithm feeds a user something unexpectedly highly stimulating, dopamine spikes above baseline.
Right.
But crucially, when an expectation is violated negatively, like when a user expects 100 likes and gets 2, or when they swipe looking for a hit and find nothing, dopamine doesn't just stay at its normal level. It plunges significantly below its baseline.
So the baseline actually drops out from under you.
Yes, the author can use this biological plunge to explain the exact cognitive emptiness and anxiety mentioned earlier in their text. The algorithm isn't just giving us a high, it is intentionally forcing the brain through extreme chemical volatility, which totally drains our cognitive reserves.
Wow. And what about the connection to oxytocin? The author mentions that we are starved of it, but how do we scientifically anchor the idea that the synthetic internet is destroying human connection?
Another concrete option is to explicitly mention the downregulation of striatal D2 receptors. The author could explain that as the brain physically adapts to the constant hyperstimulation of AI slop, it essentially attempts to protect itself by reducing its total number of dopamine receptors.
Oh, I see.
Think of it like building a massive tolerance to caffeine. Eventually, you numb yourself to the baseline, so a normal cup of coffee does absolutely nothing. Because of this structural downgrading, the slow, natural release of neurochemicals you would normally get from a genuine real-life human interaction literally fails to register.
The signal isn't loud enough to pierce through the newly built tolerance.
Exactly. The brain basically becomes deaf to normal human connection. Integrating this shows the reader that, It isn't that we simply don't want to connect anymore. It is that our hardware has been mutated by the software to the point where real life doesn't provide enough of a chemical signal to register.
That is chilling.
It really takes the dead internet theory out of the realm of abstract philosophy and places it directly into the realm of public health.
That significantly darkens the premise, but it grounds it in undeniable structural mechanics. It completely changes the weight of the argument.
Yeah, pushing the rigor of these arguments moves the piece from a surface-level observation to a deeply unsettling, systemic critique.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful dive. Let us cleanly recap the insights we have covered today to give the listener a direct path forward for their next draft.
Sounds good.
We focused on 3 core areas to strengthen this critique of the dead internet and the slop economy. First, we addressed the dead internet reality. The critique focused on the need to refine the distinction between benign background bots and extractive agentic AI. To implement this, the author needs to highlight the extraction gap of modern crawlers, demonstrating the massive ratio of what they scrape versus the zero traffic they return, to prove this is about parasitic behavior, not just raw traffic volume.
Right.
Second, we examined model collapse and digital decay. We identified the need to move past the fatalistic doom loop narrative by acknowledging the accumulate mathematical workaround. By doing this, the author can pivot the narrative to focus on the 2026 human data drought, proving that human data is the only cure for model collapse, which makes its scarcity an existential threat.
Exactly.
And finally, we looked at the neurobiology of slop. We established the need to move past outdated slot machine metaphors and deepen the biological stakes. The actionable step there is to integrate the mechanics of negative reward prediction error and receptor downregulation, proving that the brain is undergoing actual structural decay and rewiring itself to reject genuine human connection.
A really solid roadmap for revision.
Absolutely. I want to warmly invite the listener to take these actionable suggestions, revise their manuscript based on these specific editorial lenses, and submit their work back to us for another round of constructive feedback. Until next time.